The cafe was warm, but it didn't feel comforting to Samuel Reed anymore. It used to. Years ago, before the world narrowed into silence, this place had been his escape, back when laughter came easily, back when mornings meant plans instead of survival. Now it was simply a habit he couldn't let go of, the last place where his life still resembled something whole. Outside, snow fell in thick, unforgiving sheets, swallowing the streets, erasing footsteps as soon as they were made. Winter had no mercy this year. Inside, cups clinked softly, a radio hummed low jazz. The smell of coffee hung in the air, rich and bitter. Samuel sat alone by the window, his shoulders slightly hunched, hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't touched in minutes. His food sat untouched. It always did. 2 years ago, his wife had kissed him goodbye right where he was sitting now. She'd teased him about ordering the same breakfast every morning. She'd brushed crumbs from his coat and complained about the snow, already late for work, already rushing. She promised she'd text when she arrived. She never made it past the third intersection. The call had come before noon. A stranger's voice. A sentence that didn't make sense. Samuel remembered standing in his kitchen afterward, staring at the wall, waiting for the world to correct itself. It never did. Since that morning, silence had moved in with him. It slept beside him, ate with him, followed him everywhere. Friends tried at first, calls, invitations, concern, but grief makes people uncomfortable. Eventually, they stopped knocking. Samuel didn't blame them. He barely spoke anymore anyway. The bell above the cafe door rang, letting in a burst of cold air and something else, desperation. A woman stepped inside, clutching a small child to her chest. Snow clung to her coat, melting into dark patches. Her shoes were soaked through. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, strands escaping and sticking to her cheeks. She looked around, hesitant, as if already bracing for rejection. The boy in her arms couldn't have been more than 3. His nose was red from the cold, his lips were slightly blue, his eyes were wide, scanning the room like he was afraid it might disappear. Samuel didn't look away at first. He rarely noticed people anymore. But something about the way the woman stood, not asking for help, not demanding anything, just hoping, made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. She approached the counter and spoke quietly to the waitress. Samuel couldn't hear the words, but he saw the waitress's expression shift. Polite, professional, final. The woman nodded quickly, embarrassment flooding her face. She murmured something apologetic and turned as if to leave. That's when her eyes met Samuel's. She hesitated. It wasn't a bold decision. It was the kind made by someone who had already been turned away too many times. She walked toward his table slowly, carefully, as if giving him time to stop her. "Excuse me," she said softly. Her voice shook despite her effort to control it. May I sit here for just a moment?" There were empty tables everywhere. Samuel frowned slightly, confused. He hadn't spoken to a stranger in months. He felt the familiar urge to retreat, to protect the quiet shell he'd built around himself. The boy shivered, burying his face into the woman's coat. Samuel swallowed. "If you sit," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse, "you should eat something." The woman's eyes widened. I don't need." "I'll order," he said, already signaling the waitress. "Please." She hesitated only a second longer before sitting down, relief crashing over her face so hard it almost looked like pain. Her name was Elena Walker. She didn't offer it right away. It slipped out later, after the food arrived, after her son, Noah, began eating like he hadn't seen a proper meal in days, which Samuel would later realize he probably hadn't. Elena kept apologizing under her breath for the crumbs, for Noah's cold hands, for taking up space, for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Samuel shook his head. You don't need to explain yourself. But she did anyway. She told him in fragments. She'd lost her job 3 weeks ago when the grocery store cut staff. Her savings were gone. Her phone had been disconnected. The shelters were full, some turning her away the moment they saw the child. The landlord had given her one last warning. She wasn't asking for money. She never did. She just needed warmth. 10 minutes out of the cold so her son could stop shaking. As Noah ate, color slowly returned to his face. He smiled when soup spilled onto the table, giggling like it was a joke meant only for them. Elena laughed softly, brushing his cheek, and Samuel felt something twist painfully inside his chest. It had been years since he'd heard that sound, a child's laugh close enough to feel real. For a moment, he wasn't drowning in memories. He wasn't replaying hospital hallways or unanswered phone calls. He was just there, human again. When they finished, Elena stood quickly, already preparing to leave, afraid she'd stayed too long. Samuel noticed how she swayed slightly when she stood, how her hands trembled when she zipped Noah's coat. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked gently. She froze. Then she shook her head once, barely noticeable. "We'll figure it out." Samuel reached into his wallet and placed a folded bill on the table. Her pride flared instantly. "I can't." "It's not charity," he interrupted quietly. "It's dinner. And maybe a cab." Her hands trembled as she picked it up. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking. "You don't know what this means." He thought he did. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the wind howl outside his apartment, imagining Alina and Noah walking through it with nowhere to go. He pictured Noah's small hands pressed into Elena's coat, her body shielding him from the cold. He told himself he'd been enough, that people crossed paths all the time and disappeared again. But something wouldn't let him rest. The next morning, he returned to the cafe earlier than usual. He didn't tell himself why. Elena was already there. Her coat looked cleaner. Her hair was tied neatly. Noah sat by the window, pressing his palms against the glass, laughing as snowflakes stuck and slid away. "You came back," Samuel said, surprised. She smiled faintly. "You left your scarf." She placed it on the table, a scarf he was still wearing yesterday. They both knew the truth. From that morning on, the café became their quiet meeting place. Elena found a few hours of work at a daycare. Samuel helped her fill out forms he barely understood himself. Noah started calling him Mr. Sam, then eventually just Sam. Weeks passed. Then one morning, Elena sat at the table alone, eyes red, hands clenched around her cup. The daycare had shut down without warning. The rent was due. Samuel felt panic rise in his chest, not for her, but for himself, for how deeply he'd let them in, for how much he stood to lose again. "I don't want you to fight alone," he said. He offered her work at his home, temporary, simple, honest. Elena cried harder than she had in weeks. Working in Samuel's house, Elena brought life back into rooms that had been frozen in time. She cooked meals that smelled like warmth. She cleaned spaces he hadn't entered since his wife died. She sang quietly when she thought no one was listening. Noah filled the silence with laughter. Some nights, Samuel locked himself in the bathroom and cried, terrified of loving again. One evening, he stood in the doorway watching them, the glow of the lamp softening the walls that once echoed with grief. "You didn't save me," Elena said gently, sensing his thoughts. "You just reminded me I wasn't invisible." Samuel swallowed hard. "Neither were you," he replied. Spring came slowly. Healing didn't erase the pain, but it made room for hope. And sometimes, hope was enough.